Now let's talk about creatures. When you draft an aggro deck, you generally want cheap creatures. You're trying to overrun your opponent, and you usually play a lot of pump spells to ensure that your creatures can keep attacking every turn. When you draft a control deck, you draft a lot of good blockers so that it's hard for your opponent to overrun you, and you can win in the late game with your powerful late game cards and card drawing. When building a seal deck, you are not specifically looking for a given trait like fast or defensive. What you are looking for are creatures that can make a meaningful contribution to you winning the game on their own. That means they generally want to be at least 3 power and toughness. I'm not saying if you have no 2-mana cards that you will never put a 2-mana 2/2 with no abilities in your sealed, but a 2-mana 2/2 with no abilities will rarely be a good card for a sealed, in the way that it can be in a good, fast, aggressive deck, with a lot of pump spells to ensure it keeps getting through. Rather, it will be a filler card that you choose to include because you don't have better 2-mana cards. It gets trickier because most cards won't be vanilla. Vanilla meaning having no text, just power and toughness. You will have to use your magic skills and what you have learned in all of the Spice classes to determine whether a creature's abilities make it good enough to include. But as a general guideline, I would consider creatures smaller than 3/3 without abilities that make them better cards to be filler and sealed. Next, I generally try and consider mana cost. You will often not make a land drop every turn forever, so as a creature becomes more expensive, it needs to be better and better to include. Similar to a 2-mana 2/2, a 7-mana 7/7 with no abilities may be included as a filler finisher card, if you didn't get better late game stuff, but I would never play 3 copies of that. Whereas a 5-mana 5/5 is a fine creature for sealed, and I would generally play all the copies of it that I opened. Generally speaking, if a creature isn't of exceptional power level, then you want to play cards that cost between 2 and 6 mana. 1-mana creatures will often be too weak to be worthy inclusions when we are looking at cards that stand on their own. 7+ mana cards will require you drawing too many lands to justify playing more than one of them in your deck, unless they are, of course, of exceptional power level. You will need to balance your curve based on how good you are at hitting land drops, but as a solid guideline, I'm looking for creatures that cost between 2 and 6 mana to fill out my seal deck. Many creatures will not be vanilla, so while I can't teach you how to evaluate set-specific abilities, I do want to talk about some of the most common abilities that we will often see from set to set, such as Flying, First Strike, and Death Touch. Flying is generally worth about a half a mana. What I mean by that is that a vanilla 2-mana 2/2 without Flying is an okay card that would be considered filler, but a 2-mana 2/2 flyer would be considered a good card. A vanilla 3-mana 2/2 without Flying would be considered a bad card, but a vanilla 3-mana 2/2 flyer would be considered an okay card, filler, but not a good card. First Strike is different. It's worth more on a creature that has more power. A 1/1 First Strike will still generally be unplayable, just like a vanilla 1/1, because the fact that it does its 1 damage first in combat isn't worth very much, since it's only 1 damage. A 4-power First Striker is worth substantially more than a 4-power non-First Striker, since it will be much harder to interact with in combat. As a general rule, I find 1-power First Strikers to still be unplayable. 2-power First Strikers are usually a solid inclusion. 3-power and up First Strikers are usually good cards. Death Touch makes a solid inclusion no matter what the size, since even a 1-power Death Touch creature can trade with a vanilla creature of any size. That means the card will never be blanked and can always be a productive card for you. How good a Death Touch creature is will vary format to format, but assuming a reasonable casting cost, such as 1 to 2 mana for a 1/1, 2 to 3 mana for a 2/2, or 4 mana for a 3/3, I would generally play all my Death Touch creatures in any seal deck. Death Touch is the opposite of First Strike in that it isn't worth much on a big creature, because a big creature with a lot of power will generally kill what is blocking it anyways. Therefore, a 5-mana 5/5 Death Touch and a 5-mana vanilla 5/5 aren't much different. This is why you generally see Death Touch on small creatures. You will need a minimum number of creatures in your sealed to be able to win the game, but this number is not as high as it is in draft. This is because you will generally not be worried about putting creatures in play every turn. You're not trying to overrun the opponent with aggression. You will also not generally be playing many combat tricks or creature-enhancing auras in your sealed deck. This means you still need a minimum number of creatures to win the game, but it is not very high. Though most sealeds will end up with far more creatures than the minimum because they are just good cards, it is generally fine to play as few as around 10 creatures in a seal deck. There is no maximum number of creatures, as they don't make each other worse, but removal, card drawing, and mana fixing are generally good cards too, so you will usually not play more than like 15 to 17 creatures. But if you don't have quality removal spells, card drawing, or mana fixing cards to fill a slot in your deck, it is acceptable to play any number of quality creature cards. So remember, creatures are something you can play any number of in your sealed, but unless you are closing some other way, I would generally play at least 10. Anything 3/3 or bigger that is reasonably costed for its power level will generally be a good inclusion. Creatures that cost between 2 and 6 mana will usually be at least solid. Synergies are less important than in draft, but of course cards will have different abilities based on the sets they are in. You will have to adjust from the baseline guidelines to account for them. Creatures and removal spells are the foundation of limited Magic, so I would err on the side of including good creatures and removal over other cards. If a creature or removal seems close in quality to a card of any other type, then I would generally go with the creature or removal spell.